Let's wait 1 minute.
Does everybody know how to get the Zoom chat thing? Because in a few other sessions, people were struggling to find where the chat window is.
I guess so.
So if anyone is still looking for it, look down in the bar, which also has the mute button. And if you don't find it there, follow the more button on the right.
Okay, so I guess we can start now. So welcome everyone to this LICS session F4. So we have 5 contributions today. So speakers will have like 2 minutes to present their work, and then you can ask the questions. So you can directly take the mic to ask your questions, and there will be also questions that come from the Slack discussion. So the first speaker is Carolina about good for games, ω-Pushdown Automata. So Carolina, you can start. So we can't hear you.
There you go.
Yeah.
So in this joint work with Martin Zimmerman, we introduce good for games pushdown automata over infinite words. These are automata in between deterministic and non-deterministic automata, in the sense that they do allow for some non-determinism, but this is very restricted. So if a word has an accepting run, we require that we be able to build this accepting run on the fly as we read the letters of the word without ever having to use the future of the word to guess how to resolve the non-determinism. So we show that this type of non-determinism is expressive enough and rich enough to express properties that are not expressible by just deterministic pushdown automata. We also show that this type of non-determinism is restricted enough that good for games pushdown automata retain some of the nice decidability properties of deterministic pushdown automata. So in particular, solving games with a pushdown acceptance condition is in general undecidable, but it becomes decidable for good for games pushdown automata. And these are the type of games that you will be solving if you want to solve the reactive synthesis problem. So those are the good news. On the bad news side, we also show that this is a class of automata that doesn't have very good closure properties. And if you do have a pushdown automaton, then it is undecidable whether it is good for games or even whether it is equivalent to a good for games pushdown automaton. But that shouldn't bring you down. That is just a good motivation to study restrictions, subclasses of good for games pushdown automata, which may enjoy nicer, better syntactic characterizations. I'll leave it there, and Martin will join me in answering all of your questions.
Thank you, Carolina. So is there any question? Because I'll start with, I have a question. So you said that good for games is undecidable for PDA. What about omega VPA? Is it also undecidable?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So is the game for gameness notion also undecidable if you start from an omega visibly pushdown automaton?
I'm not sure. I don't think we looked at that. And the undecidability proof, it doesn't. I don't think it obviously works for visibly pushdown automata. Martin, do you have an intuition about what might happen there?
No, not really. So we haven't looked at visibly pushdown automata yet. I would assume the proofs don't work, as you said, because we start from reducing from undecidable problems for the general case that are just not undecidable for the visibly case. So one would have to come up with new proofs.
Okay.
On the other hand, it's not completely clear that it should be decidable, because the classical characterizations for good for gameness would yield here a sort of game with two stacks, I would assume. That might or might not be problematic with visibly pushdown automata. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting question for future work to look at good for games visibly pushdown automata.
Okay, and more generally, so is there any restriction on PDA that have decidable good for gameness? When that would be one, but have you thought about other restrictions?
So we haven't found any so far.
Okay.
But it would be something that would be nice to understand.
Okay.
But yeah, the proof of undecidability is quite simple. So we were thinking about things like, what about good for games with a very simple kind of resolver? But the undecidability proof already has a very simple resolver, which makes it a bit more difficult.
Okay, but so and the notion of resolver is just a function that picks some transitions, right? So it's a very general definition. If you like restrict the class of resolvers to, I don't know, finite memory or something, so have you thought about some restrictions also that could yield decidability? Or, I mean, is it even decidable in the case of memoryless or resolver?
So in the proof of undecidability, the resolver, if I recall correctly, is extremely simple. So that doesn't need any, that's just making a single positional choice. And
okay, it's a positional.
if I recall correctly. So yeah, so that's we kind of tried to think about that, but it doesn't seem to help, at least not with deciding whether that it is good for games. But then on the other hand, good for games automata with simple resolvers might be interesting for in themselves for other reasons.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So is there other questions?
There's a question on Slack, I think.
So there was a question on Slack.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just, can you comment on this finite words question mark? What would be different for finite words?
So that's something we're currently looking at. And at first we thought, at least I thought, that in finite words, it might turn out to be like for regular automata where good for gameness doesn't give you additional expressivity over deterministic automata. But at the moment we're looking at it and it looks like you do actually get more expressivity even on finite words. But yeah, that's so hopefully that will become clearer.
But good for gameness would still be undecidable, right?
Yeah, I think the undecidability proofs carry over to finite words.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there is another question from Slack by Peng Feng. So are you here? Can you ask the question? Or Rupa, can you ask a question maybe?
Sure. I think this is a question that was asked and already answered on Slack. So the question was, can you provide some insight why the closure properties do not hold?
So essentially, they inherit the worst of both worlds. So, so we have this. We can go back to this table where we can see that for whenever the closure property doesn't hold for deterministic pushdown automata, it doesn't hold for good for games, and whenever it doesn't hold for non-deterministic, it doesn't hold for good for games. So you kind of get the worst of both worlds there. And like for union, the intuition is fairly simple, that if you take the union of two languages, that's a non-deterministic choice. And there's no way to force that union to be good for games. And yeah, for the complement, like the language we have in the paper that proves the additional expressiveness of good for games automata. If you take its complement, that's not even context free, so there's no chance of complementation. So yeah, that's the kind of, you get the worst of everything.
Okay, thanks. So there is one more question from Slack. So we'll take so that will be the last question. So Rupa, can you read it?
Yes. So this is a question from Salomon Sickert, which was also answered on Slack. The question is, in your setting, the resolver can examine the whole finite prefix of transitions taken so far, which would be equivalent to the finite prefix of the word plus the number of epsilon transitions since the last letter, right? Have you an insight into how much additional power does this counter of epsilon transitions give you compared to a GFG setting where only the finite prefix is given? So you cannot see the number of epsilon transitions.
Yeah, so I think Martin answered it already on Slack, but essentially the epsilon transitions add some kind of technical overhead of how do you deal with them, because as Solomon points out, if you only have the history of the word, you don't know how many, you don't have all the information you need. We don't think it matters very much. I think, at least from our point of view, it's kind of a technical annoyance that needs to be dealt with, but either by normalizing the automaton, saying that all the epsilon transitions have to be resolved, say you have to resolve the non-epsilon transitions and then take an actual step and define the resolver slightly differently, but we don't think it makes any actual meaningful difference.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolina and Martin. So now we'll move to the next contribution on making strict determinization tight. So the speaker is Wenxing Huang. So are you here? So we had a technical problem at the beginning. So now, are you here, Wenxing? Okay, still not. So let's move to the next talk on uniformization of regular relations over bi-infinite words. And so the speaker is Grigorz. Now you can present your work.
Hello, I want to talk about uniformization of regular relations over bi-infinite words. So let me explain every terms in the title. So we take some relation between two sets x and y, and we want to take this to make this relation a function. So we call a uniformization of relation a functions which have the largest possible domain and is contained in this relation. So this red line is, for example, one of many possible uniformization of this green relation. And obviously every relation has uniformization, and this easily follows from axiom of choice. So for each horizontal slice, you have to pick just any point and mark it red from each horizontal green slice. So it is obvious to consider uniformization for when you consider any possible sets, but we want to consider only regular relations and regular functions. So we restrict ourselves into the world, the universe of regular things, and we have given as an input some regular relation between worlds and worlds, or infinite worlds and infinite worlds, or bi-infinite worlds and bi-infinite worlds, and we ask ourselves a question whether this relation has regular uniformization. So in some sense, we check the validity of the axiom of choice after restriction to only regular things. And in the case of finite worlds, it is well known that every relation has uniformization. For the infinite world, the same holds. And for infinite trees, the situation is complicated. So we know some examples when the relation does not admit uniformization, but proving this is hard, and the current techniques doesn't allow us to find some general criterion which relations of infinite trees have uniformizations and which not. So we are looking for the simplest possible case where the same holds as in the case of infinite reads, namely not every relation of uniformization. And by infinite words is probably the simplest structures where this holds. And we want to provide some criterion. So we consider the decision problem where as input we are given a regular relation, and we have to decide whether it has uniformization. And what we done if we provide some algorithm for this problem. So this problem is decidable. And moreover, we show some criterion for uniformization. And this criterion is of algebraic nature. So we consider the syntactic monoid of this relation and then some properties of this monoid. And there is, let me skip the examples. And there is nice hypothesis that is quite natural when you start working with this problem. So namely, every basic example which doesn't have uniformization has some problems with shifts. So B-infinite words are a specific structure. We have such that you consider to have some non-trivial invariance of the structure. And there is a natural hypothesis that if relation admits a shift invariant uniformization, so this relation doesn't have any problem with shifts with respect to uniformization, then this relation will have a regular uniformization. This is a natural hypothesis, and it turns out to be false. So the situation is much more tricky than it seems when you encounter this problem at first. And there's some nice counterexamples about this. And in this counterexample, you are given a words where each have letters like this, input words like this, and you want to, in uniform way, choose one path. This blue path. And these relations have shift invariant uniformization and doesn't have any regular uniformization. And this is not so easy to prove, and I believe this kind of example is nice. Yeah, so that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. So is there any question? So
there is a question from the Slack channel from Dimitri. So Dimitri is on the online, so perhaps he could just state the question.
Yeah, thank you. This was a very nice presentation. So you kind of give the statement that there are other obstacles to uniformization beyond just shift invariance, and I was wondering whether, what is the right way to capture them, because you only just mentioned that, okay, here is the example and there is a criterion, but like what kind of instruments do you use to capture these obstacles? Yeah,
so in this example, we have some group. So if you consider these input letters, they form group. You can compose and you do two of these permutations and get another one. And in fact, usually when you consider the algebraic structure of the monoids, the groups are the simplest possible situation. And here there's exactly the opposite. So we consider we are given some syntactic monoid from this relation R. We build from this monoid some good monoid from the projection into input alphabet. Because, so if you have some relation, then obviously projection to single part of the input alphabet, maybe the input letters, is a regular language, but we want to take a nice monoid which recognizes input, somehow connected to this monoid from the full relation. And then we consider groups in this monoid from the input alphabet, and we want to, for each possible, inside this group, there is nice strategy to uniformize things. So namely, if you have the elements from this group, so this is a power set construction. So each element in this monoid which recognize the projection corresponds to, you are given some input letters and you consider every possible word that you can write of output letters, and then you have some sets of values in this monoid M. So namely for each input letter, you can just, for each element from this power set monoid, you can just pick a represented so that you can do this uniformization locally just by looking at this single letter. And this is required. If you cannot, whenever you have uniformization, you can find strategy like this. And if you cannot find strategy like this, you cannot find any possible uniformization. So there is some interplay between groups in this power set monoid and these groups in the original monoid.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. So you talked about decidability of finding regular uniformizations. What is known about the complexity? In particular, what is the best complexity lower bounds known?
So we don't know everything about lower bounds. We don't optimize the complexity. So we use some lemma in our proof, which gives you the height of tower of exponentials, because we construct some lengthy MSO formula. And we made the induction on the J-class order. And in each next step, we added additional quantifiers. So this is absolutely inefficient, and probably this can be made more efficient, but we don't know whether this is in some 2 exponential or something like that. We give some algorithm which is have tower complexity, and we don't optimize.
Another question? I have a question, so it's a basic question. So how your the case of bi-infinite words is a particular case of the infinite tree? I mean, in the infinite tree, you may have the root node, which you don't have in the bi-infinite words. So.
Yeah, so what I'm going to say is not formal, but the first known example of the language which doesn't admit uniformization of infinite trees is a choice language. So you are given 2 letter alphabets, A and B, and you want to choose one letter A. And it is easy to see that you are given some input of the letters A, but for example, you can only consider cases when these letters A's form an anti-chain. So for each letter A, there is no letter A below.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is natural intuition that what MSO can see is just can see some scattered order of these letters A. And you want to pick a one. So it is highly probable, and bi-infinite words are just a special case of the scattered order, right? So it's highly probable that if you want to do full uniformization of trees of infinite trees, then you have to be able to deal with situations like this. Because even if there is this root, but MSO formula cannot see the letters which is nearest to the root. You can just see an order between these A letters.
Okay. And so, and if you have the 0, is it always uniformizable?
Yeah. So because single infinite words always admit uniformization, then whenever you fix the element of B-infinite words, this B-infinite words splits to 2 single infinite words, and you can uniformize them independently, roughly speaking.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question? Okay, so thank you very much, Grzegorz. And so we'll move to the, so Wenxin, maybe as a working mic now. So Wenxin, can you can present your work now. Wenxin? Okay, so still not. So we'll move to the next Wenxin? It seems to be working. So let's move to the next contribution on repairing brackets by Dmitry Zhitsikov. Dmitry, you can present your work.
Okay, hold on. Hold on, I'm just doing the sharing.
Try again sharing now.
Dimitri, are you still there? So we can't hear you, at least me, I can't hear you anymore. Okay, so and Wangsheng, so if a message on the chat saying that it should be working now. Wangsheng. Okay, so still not. So I guess we'll move to the next contribution by Nathan on Pebble minimization in transducers.
Thank you. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to briefly summarize this work called Pebble minimization of polyregular functions. So polyregular functions were coined by Mikołaj Bojanczyk, in this article 2 years ago, he showed that this model of Pebble transducers, which had been previously defined, was equivalent to several other models here on the right. And later we, together with Sandra Kiefer, showed that there's a fifth, we found a fifth model equivalent to it, namely MSO interpretations. So let me quickly define what is a Pebble transducer. So here I'll define a transducer with k pebbles. So it's a model of two-way automata where you have a stack of reading heads. And only the head at the top of the stack, here in yellow, is active. And the stack height is bounded by k. So to take a transition, depending on the current state, the letter read by the active head, and the set of other heads on this position, you take a transition which consists in a new state, moving the active head either to the left or to the right, popping this active head, making this one the new active head, or pushing a new head onto the stack. And then since we're talking about transducers, you can also potentially output something. So this should be gamma star. So that's the model. And one remark that's easy to make is that the number of configurations over some input word of length n is bounded by some constant times n to the k, because there are at most k reading heads on the input, and there can be in n different locations. This means, in particular, that the output length is at most in big O of n to the k. So the question that we tried to tackle was, is the converse true? If I have a Pebble transducer with, let's say, 1,000 pebbles, but I know the output length is at most cubic in the input, can I obtain an equivalent Pebble transducer that uses fewer pebbles? So the result is that yes, the growth of a polyregular function is exactly equivalent to the number of pebbles needed to realize it. And slightly stronger, we can even minimize the number of pebbles that we need. So given some Pebble transducer, we can obtain a new one with the optimal number of pebbles, which is just the growth rate. In particular, we can decide if a polyregular function is regular, regular meaning can be done with only one pebble. And as a corollary, we also obtain this nice characterization that the dimension of MSO interpretations exactly coincides with the number of pebbles, which is very far from obvious in itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So is there any question on this work?
So
okay,
I had a question that I asked on Slack, so maybe I could just repeat this. So You said at the end of the of the video that it would be very nice to kind of extend this further in the direction of the equivalence problem, which is, given two such machines decide whether they implement the same
Oh yeah,
function.
I forgot the last slide, right? Can you see?
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's right. So, and I was just wondering if for this model there is already anything known about this connection between like equivalence and minimization questions.
So I think no, and I think minimization is way more out of reach than tackling equivalence. The reason is that already for regular functions, so only one Pebble, for which we can decide equivalence, we have no idea of how to obtain a minimal or canonical machine. So I think, yeah, we are very far from obtaining minimal or canonical automata, but equivalence, and whether it is true or it is decidable or not, I think is a more approachable problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other question?
So yeah, just to comment on this last slide. Yeah, so what we can do next is to study the growth, but for other models. So the 5 models that I presented earlier. This question of obtaining minimal and canonical automata, which might help us to solve the equivalence problem. But as I said, I think this is extremely hard. And also obtaining a model of register automata would be a nice addition to this already nicely behaved class. Thank you.
Okay, so you mentioned that in the regular case, you have a dichotomy. You're either for the growth, I mean, you're either in O of 1 or theta of n, so it wasn't clear. Do you have also a kind of similar result like you are in O of 1 or theta of n or theta of n square? And
yes, exactly. So if I maybe can share again. So wait, it's going too fast. So yeah, this result gives you that you can be realized by a k-Pebble transducer if and only if you're in big O of n to the k. So if you're in big O of n to the k minus 1 also, then you can be done by k minus 1 Pebble, right? So
okay.
So yeah, okay, it's not exactly being theta of n to the k, but actually it is. So okay, this result, yeah. So yeah, if you can be done with k and not with k minus 1 Pebble, then the growth is in theta of n to the k.
Ah, so that's in your paper, or is it a consequence, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's phrased like that, but yeah.
And so if you only care about the complexity of deciding the growth, so what's the complexity?
It's pretty bad. So it's by induction on this k, and at every step of the induction, there's some like monoid that you construct, and then there's some Ramsey arguments to obtain some bounds. So yeah, I think this is awful complexity.
Okay. Okay, so I had another question about, so you study the growth, but you could also study the space complexity of evaluating a transduction, or the time complexity. So for the space complexity, if you have k-Pebbles, I guess you just have to store those k-Pebbles, and that's it. And for time complexity, I've seen in your talk that to minimize the number of Pebble, you need lookarounds. Okay, so how big are those lookarounds? Because they will impact the time.
Not sure. What do you mean the size of the look around will impact the time?
Okay, so just the size of the automaton.
Okay. So yeah, this look around automaton is something of the awful kind I was discussing before, with making use of some Ramsey arguments.
Okay, but if you fix the transducer, what's the time complexity to get the output? If say you have capables.
What do you mean?
And you just only get the input.
Yeah.
And the transducer is fixed in the input. So I was wondering.
Well, then it's like n to the k, right?
It's just n to the k. It's not more. I mean, there is a difference between the growth and the time complexity, but not here. Okay. Is there? Yeah.
Yeah. You could have also some kind of better complexity if you ask some other kind of problem, like, okay, I input j and I would like the jth output position.
Okay.
Then using some kind of Simon factorization first, you could obtain this without having to do the whole run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so is there any other question? So maybe one last question. And so if you don't fix so your Pebble minimization procedure works if you're given a K-Pebble, a transducer with a bounded number of pebbles. And what if you have an unbounded number of pebbles? Is it known how to decide whether your function is polyregular or is it unknown?
So yeah, you go beyond the expressiveness of polyregular functions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we'd have to check, but yeah, I think everything would be undecidable. Yeah, I would have to check. I would say so. Okay,
so thank you very much, Nathan.
Thank you.
So we will now move back to the talk by Dimitri on repairing brackets. So if it's work now.
Hold on, let me share. So if I do this and then hold on. Whoop. Yep. Okay. Works. Great. So so this is joint work with Mikhail Gali, who I think is also in the room. So let me briefly tell you about what this thing is about. So this is a new game or a new puzzle that is motivated by a problem in formal language theory. And the problem in the formal language theory is the Parikh theorem, or the version of Parikh theorem for one-counter languages. So if you translate from context-free grammars to just regular languages, and you want to maintain the Parikh image, that is the commutative image of every word, then there is a theorem from from many years ago that you can do this always, and the gap is exponential, as people have realized. If you restrict context-free grammars to just one-counter automata, OCA, then the blow-up in the size becomes quasi-polynomial, n to the big O of log n. So in this, and the symbol is just the commutative image. So now the question is this tight? Can you make it polynomial, or is it really, does it have to be lower bounded by a quasi-polynomial function? And this is not just a pure theoretical question, because there are questions in kind of further verification of infinite state systems that reduce to construction of these automata. So, and it turns out that for a certain machine that already appears in this paper 4 years ago, or rather a variant of this machine, and it's shown here, this is a one-counter automaton, and it has this lower bound, and this is what we prove in this paper, that every NFA that accepts a language that's Parikh equivalent to the language of this one counter automaton, that every NFA has this quasi-polynomial size. So this is the main result of the work that I'm showing. And kind of the source of hardness here is showing lower bounds against NFA, because basically there are very few methods available. So, and what we offer here is the following game, or one-player game. So it's defined for Duke words, or, well, let me replace them with signs. So this is a well-balanced word. And then the game is you can remove pairs of pluses and minuses. Plus must be to the left of the minus, but not necessarily adjacent. So for example, you can remove this block, then, and the goal is to erase everything, then these ones, and then this one. So you kind of win, but then what you want to minimize is the width, and this is the number of islands separated by blank space. So you start with kind of one big block, 1. Then you, after you remove these two, the width becomes 2, because there is one block here and another block here. And then the width stays at 2, and then it goes down to 0, and that's the end. Now, the width of this repairing is the maximum. This is 2, so that's what you get. But maybe there are strategies that give you lower width. And the question is, can you show lower bounds on the width? So basically, lower bounds on the width of all possible strategies for a given word. And what we do in this paper is that we show that there are words that have unbounded width. Well, formally, there is a sequence of words such that the width is unbounded. So read this as tends to infinity, and the length of these words just tends to infinity. And then the second part is that from lower bounds on the width, you can get lower bounds on the size of NFA for that machine that I showed you previously. So, and basically this expression will show up in the exponent. So as long as this tends to infinity, this will be a super polynomial lower bound. And I'm sweeping a lot of things under the rug here. For example, which words here you must pick. In fact, here you can pick any sequence of words that are, let's say, of length n, or, well, to be more precise, square root of n. So these are the two parts of our result beyond the introduction of this repairing game. So thank you. Questions?
Thank you. So is there any question? There was a few questions on Slack, so maybe they can be repeated here. Rupak, so you have them?
Yes, so let me. So the question asked on Slack is by Songao. And the question is, are the lower bounds on the width and the NFA size both reachable? Are they based on the hardest example on the slide of your talk?
Okay, so I think my co-author Mikhail already answered partly, and let me just expand on his answer. So indeed, this lower bounds on NFA size, this bound, is specifically for the one counter language for the machine that I showed previously. That's true. So now about whether these bounds are reachable. So we don't quite know, because here the lower bound is n to basically square root of n. This factor is very small, but the upper bound is n power big O of log n. So in the exponent, there is this gap between square root of n and log n. We don't know where it is. So for width of words, we really know very little. And what we show a connection that lower bounds on the width imply lower bounds here. But we don't really know if upper bounds for the width imply small NFA. So this is kind of one gap that remains. So, and somehow just figuring out how to prove lower bounds on width, this is kind of quite out of reach. We had to use quite difficult combinatorics. Interestingly, we don't have a non-constructive argument that would say, oh, well, at least some word must be hard. So that is open. The techniques here are maybe related to what other colleagues in the session are showing, because if you think about these repairings, you can represent using trees, And these are basically derivations of finite index matrix grammars, which are these EDTOL or MSO transductions. And when you reason about these trees for this repairing problem, you kind of are very close to reasoning, kind of proving lower bounds on these other formal models, and we hope to extend these lower bounds that we get here to streaming string transducers eventually. So I think this answers the second part of the question that was asked.
Okay, thank you. And so, is there any other questions?
No, not on Slack.
Not on Slack. Okay. Grzegorz,
what are the best upper bounds for this width that you are aware of?
Oh, right. So if you have a word of length k, then there is definitely a repairing strategy of width log k. Well, let's say something like 3 log k or 4 log k. And this corresponds to pebbling games. So there is this classic pebbling games on trees, Langauer, Tarjan, or just evaluating kind of, and this is, and the optimal answers there are the Strahler numbers that I think there was a talk on parity games that kind of uses the Strahler numbers. And this is where the upper bound, the in this picture comes from. So this is kind of Strahler number for a tree of n with n leaves. So, but in principle, you know, even for kind of very balanced words, there are completely crazy strategies. So we show in our paper how to repair kind of a complete balanced tree using a strategy of length n, where you know you use width that's less than n, less than square root of n, less than cube root of n. It becomes something like 2 to the power square root of log n. So which is quite, yeah, so. But really, we don't really know how to deal with these repairing as well.
Okay, thank you. So there is a question by Georg. So you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So the result is slightly discouraging because even for one counter automata, it's hard to find, well, it's not polynomial to find an Parikh equivalent finite automaton. So the question is there any infinite state model that we can use? So it seems like unambiguous and deterministic won't help here because I think the language is both of those things. But one thing that might be doable is, what about if the counter is allowed to go below 0? I think this is not ruled out. Is that right?
I'm just thinking. So, so you're asking what happens if in the language that we. So the question is what can we do instead of NFA here, or no, what can we change here so that
you start with a one counter automaton where the counter is allowed to go below 0. Can you then construct a polynomial size Parikh equivalent?
I see. So
does
this
lower bound apply to that situation?
I see what you mean. So it's kind of Z vast with only one counter.
Yes.
See what you mean.
Or let's say fixed dimensional Z vast maybe.
Let me see. No, I mean, somehow our constructions, I think, use the fact that counter stays non-negative in a crucial way. So, so in this example that, you know, comes from, well, basically yourself in, you know, in this paper 4 years ago, I think if you change that thing, it kind of loses the hardness property. So maybe for the analogous automaton where the counter is allowed to go below 0, there will be a small NFA, but maybe there will be a different automaton for which there will be a lower bound. That's a very good question. What changes if this is a Z OCA? Thank you.
Is there any other question? So if not, so thank you very much, Dimitri. So now I know that Wangsheng tried hard to make it work. So we'll have one last try for the contribution of Wangsheng on determinization. So Wangsheng, you can try now. Is Wenxing connected? Yes.
He's connected with three
Hello.
dots.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
yes,
we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Sorry for the internet problem.
Okay. So I guess you're not able to share your screen, or is it okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so you can present your work. Thanks.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, you can start if you want.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. You can start the presentation. And we see your slides.
Okay. Let's sorry for the internet problem. Now let's begin. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, you can begin.
My name is Wensheng Wang from Xidian University, China. Our topic is making straight determinization tight. Optimal determinization construction of straight automaton is an important social problem because it is indispensable in numerous applications, such as decision problems for tree-temporal logics, solving infinite games, and system synthesis. As for the state complexity of straight automata, two wrapping automata and a asymptotic test bound has been proved, but what about the exact one? Two parity automata, there is still a big gap between the upper and lower bounds. Therefore, our goal is to make the state complexity for straight determinization construction tight or tighter. We present two determinization constructions called H-subtree and Lear H-subtree and construct an algorithm to prove lower bounds. With H-subtrees and Lear H-subtrees, straight automata can be transformed into equivalent deterministic wrapping and parity automata. Which improves the state of the other straight determinization constructions. By the algorithm, we prove straight lower bound for determinization construction from straight to wrapping automata, which matches the state complexity of the proposed construction exactly. Besides, we put forward a state lower bound for determinization construction from straight to parity automata, which is the same as the state complexity of the proposed construction in the exponent. That's all. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Wenxing. Is there any questions on this contribution?
There is a question on Slack that I can read out. So this is
yes, please.
This is from Yong Li, and the question states, "Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. There are two questions. The first one is that in Safra trees, each node is assigned with an index, and I didn't see those indices in the trees defined here. Are they implied in some way, or are they just not used?"
As for thanks for the question. As for the question, in each subtrees, each node has index label with the index of each node tau, denoted by J, is defined by the element in the of tau p, but not the label of tau, where tau p is the parent of tau, particularly if the index label of the node is the same as its parent. the index of the node is 0. In short, the index J of a node is implied by its index label H. That's all. Thanks for your question.
There is a second part. The second part states, I get that you do the vertical merge for identifying the accepting nodes, but I didn't get what you mean by horizontal merge. Actually, you are deleting empty nodes and not merging them, right? Could you elaborate more on the horizontal merge of nodes in a tree?
For the horizontal merge makes the state labels of two siblings disjoint. If a state occurs in both state labels of two siblings at the same time, we will merge the state by removing the state from one of the two siblings. After this merge, they may be removed. There may be some empty nodes. Then delete this empty node. The node whose name is defined is called rejecting. So the horizontal merge also identifies the rejecting node. That's all. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. So is there any other question? So I have a question on your acceptance mode. So you start from an automaton that accepts with accepting states, and you go to a model of where acceptance is on transitions. So you move from states to transitions. And now if you moved from states acceptance to states acceptance, so does it make a difference? And does it make a difference?
Sorry, I can't follow you. I beg your pardon.
Okay. So maybe so, and the sound is not very good. So I propose that if there are other questions, they can be asked directly on Slack. Okay. So thank you very much for your contribution. So is there any questions on all the talks, on all the contributions that you may want to ask now? Okay, so if not, then I will close the session. So I would like to thank all the speakers and all the participants for this session, and bye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can clap with the reaction button.